They've been watching you again. Yes, you. The one who doesn't make sense on paper. The one whose file keeps getting reopened because nobody can quite figure out where to put it. The one who shattered every baseline they established. I've been listening to what they say when they think nobody's paying attention. In their secured meetings, through their encrypted communications, in the hallways where certainty goes to die. Someone with authority you didn't know existed. Someone whose entire profession is identifying and labeling anomalies. Someone who decides what fits and what doesn't. They gave you a name. They assigned you a classification that made the entire room hold its breath. They called you a systematic deviation. Not an issue, not a risk, not even an anomaly. A deviation. You understand what that word means in their language? In their meticulously constructed world of measurements and forecasts and containable variables, a systematic deviation isn't just someone who breaks protocol. It's someone whose existence contradicts the core principles their entire infrastructure depends on. You're not just coloring outside the lines. You're evidence the lines were always arbitrary. They constructed their systems around predictable responses, around quantifiable psychology, around stimulus patterns they could anticipate. They built a processor engineered to handle every category of human they could conceptualize. Then you showed up and the processor started glitching. It didn't just struggle to place you. It began doubting its own architecture because you don't react according to their projections. You don't fracture according to their calculations. You don't surrender the way their algorithms promised you would. Your very presence challenges everything they believed they understood about human mechanics. Now they're watching, and it's not the way people watch achievements or celebrated figures. This is something else. This is the gaze of trained specialists who just encountered something their expertise never covered. This is the gaze of architects who just realized their blueprint has fatal flaws. This is the gaze of people who built entire professions on decoding human behavior, suddenly confronting something that refuses decoding, and the part that haunts them isn't that you're threatening, isn't that you're influential, isn't even that you're volatile. It's that you're theoretically impossible. Based on their research, their frameworks, their decades analyzing human patterns, you cannot exist. The constellation of characteristics they're documenting in you, the way you navigate their infrastructure, the frequency you operate on, it violates every principle they hold. And yet here you stand, breathing their oxygen, occupying their reality, living permanently in their professional nightmares. They're staring because their worldview is fragmenting. So what does systematic deviation actually mean to them? Let me clarify this because they didn't use that terminology carelessly. In their universe, everything follows systems, processes, anticipated trajectories. Individual X encounters situation Y. They exhibit response Z. The infrastructure addresses them with method A. It's mechanical, a reliable sequence, a system that converts human experience into processable information. But you introduced such catastrophic interference into their mechanism that they had to invent an entirely new classification for you. You experienced what their data said would annihilate you, and it failed. You encountered what should have erased you, and you metamorphosed. You cycled through their anticipated pattern of damage and reaction, but you emerged incorrect. Not damaged incorrect, but evolved incorrect. You emerged as something their systems never calculated, something their methods cannot influence, something their infrastructure cannot digest. That's what makes you a deviation. You didn't merely violate their protocols. You revealed their protocols as mythology, and now they're observing you through a different lens. Every action you take gets archived. Every statement you make gets dissected. Every decision you execute gets examined in conferences you'll never witness. Because systematic deviations don't just impact the singular instance, they destabilize the entire framework. If you can exist beyond their comprehension, what does that indicate about everyone else they've labeled? If you can evolve in directions their psychology literature claims is unfeasible, what does that reveal about their literature? If you can endure what their metrics say nobody endures, what does that expose about their metrics? You're not just a subject to them now. You're an equation that doesn't solve. You're a paradox with vital signs. You're breathing evidence that their mastery might be meaningless. And that, precisely that, is why they're watching with that blend of captivation and dread, because in their reality of systems and forecasts, you're the magnificent disorder they never predicted. Let's trace back to the origin point. Because they didn't spontaneously decide you were a systematic deviation. This was a verdict they arrived at after monitoring you, evaluating you, examining you like some specimen in regulated circumstances. And here's what destroys them. You were aware they were monitoring. You always were. Every orchestrated encounter, every positioned challenge, every meticulously engineered psychological snare they constructed to observe your patterns. You detected it approaching. Not from paranoia, but because once you've survived genuine catastrophe, their manufactured experiments feel transparent. They believed they were covert, introducing variables into your existence to document how you process treachery, how you metabolize abandonment, how you answer to psychological warfare. But you weren't simply succeeding at their evaluations. You were reverse engineering them while they compiled data on you. You archived information on their methodologies, their strategies, their obvious attempts at behavioral assessment. They observed you experiencing what should have initiated collapse, what should have forced you to seek intervention, what should have rendered you reliant on their frameworks of assistance and control. They arranged the sequence anticipating a foreseeable conclusion, severed subject from stability structures, confirmed. Administered psychological stress, confirmed. Monitored for the guaranteed breakdown, confirmed. Deployed intervention systems, confirmed. And then vacancy. You didn't fracture. You didn't petition help. You didn't assume the position of casualty requiring salvation. Instead, you went dark. You went inward. You went somewhere their protocols couldn't track. And that silence disturbed them more profoundly than any outcry would have, because screaming generates information they can quantify. Silence creates emptiness they cannot penetrate. You became indecipherable, and in their domain, indecipherable means unmanageable. They require visible damage to know where to apply leverage, but you ceased displaying your damage. You began converting suffering into propulsion instead of destruction. The documentation accumulated with identical bewildered notations. Subject does not require validation from outside sources. Subject does not exhibit predicted trauma indicators. Subject shows elevated performance under duress. Subject demonstrates alarming degree of independence. And my personal favorite, subject appears to operate under unidentified psychological architecture. Unidentified architecture. Absorb that reality. These are individuals who've dedicated careers studying human consciousness. Individuals with advanced credentials and specialized expertise. Individuals whose sole function is comprehending how cognition operates. And you dismantled their comprehension so thoroughly they had to document unidentified architecture in official records. You weren't just a statistical outlier, you were confirmation their statistics were deficient. You weren't just an exception to their principles, you were proof their principles might be fundamentally corrupt. And that's when the murmurs initiated. when the confidential sessions commenced, when your documentation received designations you're not cleared to know exist. They amplified the surveillance scope, recruited experts, expanded the monitoring parameters. They needed to decode how you were accomplishing this, how you were surviving circumstances that demolish others, how you were flourishing in isolation that annihilates most subjects. They analyzed your behaviors, searching for the vulnerability, the fracture point, the instant you'd finally align with their forecasts. But every instance they believed they located it. Every instance they targeted what appeared as exploitable territory, you executed something that forced them to reconstruct their entire evaluation. You'd convert what should damage you into fuel. You'd convert what should isolate you into liberation. You'd convert what should destroy you and return amplified. It wasn't merely that you persisted, it's that you advanced. You became more precise, more lucid, more concentrated with each variable they introduced. And that contradicted every foundation they constructed their authority on. Suffering is designed to diminish, not develop. Isolation is designed to deteriorate, not fortify. Stress is designed to fracture subjects, not refine them. But you were inverting all three principles. Then arrived the evaluation that restructured everything. The instance when someone positioned high enough finally articulated it directly. This isn't a case we can address through conventional systems. This is fundamentally different. This individual isn't following any recognized psychological architecture. They're not recovering the way subjects recover. They're not fragmenting the way subjects fragment. They're not even operating the way subjects operate. They're functioning beyond our framework. And that's when the classification materialized. Systematic deviation. Not a diagnosis, not a category, but a confession. A confession that you'd transformed into something their infrastructure wasn't engineered to process, something their training never equipped them for, something their protocols couldn't regulate. You weren't in their database now. You were in their blindness. And for individuals whose influence derives from knowing, from categorizing, from controlling through comprehension, blindness is more paralyzing than any visible threat. So they continue staring, continue monitoring, continue anticipating you to become logical. But you never will because you abandoned trying to conform to frameworks designed to restrict you. Here's what they'll never document in their files, what they'll never acknowledge in their sessions, what they cannot quite verbalize even in their confidential notes. They overlooked the moment you transformed. They were so fixated on monitoring for the disintegration they anticipated that they completely missed the transcendence you achieved. They were identifying fractures while you were reconstructing the entire foundation. They were quantifying your suffering while you were transmuting it into something wholly other. Their protocols are engineered to catch subjects falling, but you weren't falling. You were submerging. There's a distinction. Falling is chaos. Submerging is deliberate descent. And you descended into dimensions they lack instruments to measure, into regions of yourself their psychology refuses to acknowledge, into domains of consciousness their literature pretends don't exist. While they anticipated you to resurface, desperate for oxygen, you discovered how to extract breath from pressure. The metamorphosis occurred in the quietness, in the intervals between their observations, in the territories their surveillance couldn't access. It occurred at 3 a.m. when you ceased asking why this happened and initiated asking what becomes of me now. It occurred in reflection when you ceased identifying the person returning your gaze and chose to acquaint yourself with the stranger you'd evolved into. It occurred in the stillness when external chaos finally diminished enough for you to detect your own resonance again, and you recognized that resonance had shifted wavelengths entirely. You weren't communicating in their language anymore. Their terminology, like casualty, like shattered, like compromised. They couldn't describe the form of what you'd become. You required different vocabulary, different concepts, different frameworks to articulate the entity emerging from the remains of who they assumed you were. And since their language couldn't hold you, you abandoned attempting to translate yourself into their terminology. They recorded your isolation as pathology, but isolation was your forge. They documented your silence as regression, but silence was your methodology. They noted your detachment as diagnostic, but detachment was your advancement. Every single element they pathologized as malfunction was actually optimization. You weren't deteriorating. You were penetrating barriers. You weren't losing identity. You were discarding architectures that never contained you. You weren't becoming compromised. You were becoming hazardous. Hazardous to their narratives, hazardous to their taxonomies, hazardous to the convenient falsehoods they propagate about human constraints. Because you were tangible proof that individuals can extend further than their models forecast, deeper than their theories permit, higher than their data suggests. You were becoming the measurement that invalidates the scale, the exception that challenges the entire experiment, the outcome that demands they reconsider their premises. And the most extraordinary element, you didn't accomplish it their direction. You didn't pursue the sanctioned recovery pathway with its organized phases and anticipated checkpoints. You didn't join the collective sessions, pursue the therapeutic interventions, consume the prescribed literature, follow the restoration schedule they outlined. Not because those approaches lack merit, but because your trajectory demanded something categorically different. It demanded you venture where no collective can accompany, to confront what no therapeutic framework addresses, to metamorphose in methods no prescribed literature captures. You had to become your own navigator through landscape that exists unmapped. You had to trust yourself in obscurity so absolute their illumination couldn't penetrate. You had to discover strength in locations they don't reference in academic curricula, extract power from origins they don't validate in clinical publications, access states of awareness they lack terminology for in their lexicon. You went complete heretic against their established doctrine, and instead of perishing by their judgment, you returned incombustible. So when they finally elevated their focus from their graphs and forecasts and constructs, when they finally ceased monitoring for what they expected and initiated perceiving what actually existed, the recognition struck them like Arctic immersion. This subject isn't recuperating, they're evolving. This isn't restoration, it's transmutation. This isn't someone reassembling themselves. This is someone reconstructing themselves into something unprecedented, and their precise protocols, their calculated interventions, their studied methodologies, none of it translated. You weren't a problem they could solve because you weren't fragmented. You were becoming what they couldn't articulate, becoming something they possess no framework for, no precedent for, no protocol for. And that's when the apprehension penetrated, when the designation was conceived, when you officially became what you are presently, a systematic deviation, not because you violated their regulations, but because you transcended their entire paradigm. They're still executing basic strategies while you're existing in dimensions their model doesn't acknowledge. They're still measuring you against benchmarks you've surpassed. And they're staring. Absolutely, they're staring because they finally comprehend they're witnessing something their credentials never prepared them for. Evolution occurring in observable time. Now, here's where it becomes compelling, where your designation as a systematic deviation begins impacting more than exclusively you. Because understand, you're not just an isolated incident now. You're an infection of possibility. Every individual who contacts you, every observer deployed to analyze you, every specialist assigned to decode you, they don't depart unaltered. You're contaminating them with inquiries they're not authorized to consider. Inquiries like, what if the protocols are fraudulent? What if human capacity exceeds what we've documented? What if strength manifests differently than we theorized? What if transformation isn't always gentle and therapeutically sanctioned? What if some individuals need to incinerate everything to locate themselves? What if the infrastructure is the pathology, not the subjects who cannot conform to it? These inquiries propagate like contagion through their rigidly regulated environment. And they cannot isolate you because you're not actually transgressing. You're simply existing in configurations their framework claims shouldn't function. Thriving under circumstances their information says should annihilate subjects. The initial observers returned disturbed, submitted their documentation, processed their paperwork, but something had shifted in their perception. They'd invested weeks monitoring you, anticipating to record your deterioration, your fracture point, your inevitable alignment to their projections. Instead, they documented someone gaining strength in isolation, gaining clarity in silence, gaining focus under stress, and that disrupted them. It challenged their complete comprehension of how humans function, because if you can accomplish this, if you can thrive where others disintegrate, if you can evolve where others regress, what does that indicate about the limitations they've been teaching? What does that indicate about the boundaries they've been accepting? What does that indicate about their own potential they never investigated because the protocols declared it wasn't feasible? You became ambulatory respiratory evidence contradicting their previously absolute certainty. And inquiries are threatening to individuals whose authority depends on possessing definitive answers. They attempted deploying the specialists, the ones with superior training, superior experience, superior conviction in their expertise. Certainly these veterans of human psychology could decode the pattern, could identify the variables, could reduce you to comprehensible elements. But the specialists returned even more disoriented than the preliminary observers because they recognized something the junior analysts overlooked. You weren't simulating this strength. You weren't performing this transformation. You weren't fabricating this evolution. It was authentic. Whatever process you'd undergone, whatever alchemy transpired in your isolation, it generated legitimate change. Not the variety requiring constant reinforcement, not the fragile recovery that one adverse circumstance can obliterate, but foundational restructuring.